I am telling you something that world was never know about.
There are files buried deep in Washington's archives. Pages yellowed by time, sealed under dust and silence. Documents stamped top secret, meant to never see the light of day. But history has a strange way of resurfacing the things we try hardest to hide. This is one of those stories, a plan so audacious, so cold, that even in the shadowy world of intelligence and war, it crossed a line. A plan called Operation Northwoods. The year was 1962. The Cold War had reached its boiling point. The United States and the Soviet Union stood toe-to-toe, locked in a nuclear standoff that could end the world in minutes. Every move mattered. Every miscalculation could ignite the apocalypse. At the heart of this tension was a small island, Cuba. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, it had fallen under the grip of a revolutionary named Fidel Castro. Once a young idealist promising freedom from dictatorship, he had instead embraced communism and aligned himself with Moscow. For Washington, it was an intolerable humiliation. The American superpower, the self-proclaimed defender of freedom, had failed to stop a communist regime from planting its flag right in the Western Hemisphere. The CIA had already tried once, in 1961, with the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. It was supposed to be quick, decisive. Instead, it became an international embarrassment. American-trained exiles were slaughtered or captured, and Castro emerged stronger than ever. President John F. Kennedy was furious. He distrusted the CIA, but he also knew something had to be done. The military, meanwhile, simmered with frustration. To them, Cuba wasn't just a failure, it was a threat. In the corridors of the Pentagon, a group of powerful men gathered. Their mission: find a way to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. But there was a problem: public opinion. The American people were tired of war. They wanted peace, prosperity, stability. Another invasion? Another foreign entanglement? It would never gain support. So someone, no one knows exactly who first said it, proposed a chilling idea. What if the public could be made to believe Cuba attacked us first? In March 1962, that idea became a document. It was drafted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. military. The title was unassuming, just justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. But inside, it was something else entirely. A blueprint for deception, a script for tragedy, a roadmap to war written in the language of false flags. The plan was simple, in theory. If the U.S. couldn't find a reason to invade Cuba, they would create one. The proposals listed in the document read like scenes from a spy thriller, only this was no fiction. They suggested faking attacks on American citizens and blaming them on Cuba. They discussed hijacking aircraft, sinking boats of refugees, blowing up U.S. Navy ships, even staging funerals for fake victims. Each act would be accompanied by a carefully crafted media campaign. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television would spread the outrage. The public would demand vengeance, and the government would respond with war. We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. One line read. Casualty lists in U.S. newspapers would cause a helpful wave of national indignation. It didn't stop there. Another proposal suggested staging a fake airliner attack. A civilian aircraft, full of college students or holiday travelers, would disappear mid-flight. The world would be told it was shot down by Cuban fighters. In reality, it would be replaced midair by a drone, a remote-controlled decoy that would be detonated to create the illusion of an attack. There was even a plan to stage assassinations of Cuban exiles, bomb cities like Miami or Washington, and plant evidence to make it all point back to Havana. Every detail was methodically outlined, every lie premeditated. The operation had one goal: to make the American people believe that Cuba was attacking them so that America would strike back. It's easy to read these words today and feel detached, to see them as relics of a paranoid era. But imagine the world in 1962. The fear of communism wasn't just political, it was existential. Schools ran duck and cover drills. Families built bomb shelters in their backyards. The threat of annihilation was real. In that climate, ethics blurred. Patriotism became justification for almost anything. And within those walls at the Pentagon, men in decorated uniforms convinced themselves they were doing what was necessary. But not everyone agreed. When the proposal reached the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, he hesitated. He knew Kennedy, and he knew this would never pass his approval. And he was right. When the document finally made its way to President John F. Kennedy, he was reportedly shocked. Disgusted, even. He rejected the plan outright. He made it clear, the United States would not wage war against its own people, not even in the name of strategy. Operation Northwoods was dead. At least, officially. But inside the Pentagon, resentment grew. To some generals, Kennedy's refusal wasn't an act of morality. It was weakness. And weakness during the Cold War was dangerous. In the months that followed, tension between Kennedy and his military advisors deepened. The Cuban Missile Crisis would erupt later that same year, pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy's resolve during that standoff earned him admiration from some, but quiet hatred from others in the defense establishment. And then, just a year later, Dallas, 1963, the world changed forever. Decades passed. Operation Northwoods remained buried, locked away in classified files. Its existence was whispered about in intelligence circles, mentioned in passing in conspiracy theories, but never proven. Then, in the 1990s, a wave of declassifications began under the Assassination Records Review Board, part of the government's effort to release documents related to the Kennedy assassination. Among those documents was a file stamped Northwoods. When journalists first saw it, they couldn't believe what they were reading. Many thought it was fake, a Cold War myth. But it wasn't. It was real. Every detail, every page, every cold-blooded scenario. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. How close had America come to staging an attack on itself? How many other operations had been planned and never revealed? The truth was terrifying not just for what Northwoods proposed, but for what it revealed about power. Because if such an idea could be seriously written, approved by generals, and presented to the president, what else could have been justified in the shadows? The narrator's voice fades into the echo of old typewriter clicks, the rustle of paper, the hum of a projector. A black and white photograph slides into view. A Pentagon conference room, 1962. Men in suits, coffee cups, cigarette smoke curling through the light. One man leans forward, his voice low. "Gentlemen," he says, "sometimes to protect democracy, we must deceive it." The screen cuts to black. A single word appears, slowly, Northwoods. The year is 1962, but the echoes of Northwoods don't fade easily. For a plan that was never executed, it left a long, cold shadow across Washington's corridors of power. Behind closed doors, some officials whispered that President John F. Kennedy's rejection of the plan had been a grave mistake, a sign of weakness that emboldened America's enemies. Others quietly applauded his restraint. But to those who had drawn up the operation, the men who believed that ends justified means, Kennedy's refusal wasn't just a disagreement. It was betrayal. They had offered him a solution, a way to turn humiliation into triumph. And he'd thrown it away. In the months that followed, the tension between the White House and the Pentagon grew unbearable. General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the man who had formally approved Operation Northwoods, soon found himself isolated. Kennedy didn't trust him anymore. By autumn, Lemnitzer was quietly reassigned to Europe, appointed Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. A polite exile for a man who tried to manipulate history. But the idea behind Northwoods didn't die with him. Inside the Pentagon, there remained a culture, one that believed America's enemies weren't just abroad, but also within. That sometimes, to protect the nation, truth itself had to be controlled. It wasn't the first time such thinking had taken root, and it wouldn't be the last. The Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962, just months after Northwoods had been buried. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Nuclear missiles had been discovered in Cuba, placed there by the Soviets. The same island that had haunted America since Castro's rise was now ground zero for potential extinction. Kennedy's advisors urged him to strike. Bomb the missile sites. Invade. The Joint Chiefs, still bitter over the Bay of Pigs, demanded action. But Kennedy resisted. He chose a blockade instead, a move of restraint, not aggression. Behind the scenes, intelligence officers and generals fumed. To them, the president wasn't being cautious, he was being cowardly. He was letting an enemy survive within arm's reach. When the crisis finally ended peacefully, when Soviet Premier Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles, the public saw Kennedy as a hero. But within certain circles of the Pentagon, that victory was an illusion. They saw only the concessions. The quiet promise to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, the deal struck behind the scenes. To them, Northwoods had been the bolder path, and Kennedy had walked away from it. And in doing so, they believed he had weakened America. In the years that followed, fragments of the Northwoods mindset began surfacing in unexpected ways. In Vietnam, false pretexts began to appear, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, for example, which would be used to justify a massive escalation of war in Southeast Asia. Declassified documents later showed that reports of North Vietnamese attacks on U.S. ships were exaggerated or manipulated. The truth bent just enough to fuel the fire. The ghosts of Northwoods were whispering again. Different place, same logic. If the people won't support a war, give them a reason to. But beyond the political realm, there was something more unsettling. A philosophical shift inside the intelligence community. After the failure of Bay of Pigs and the exposure of Northwoods, the CIA and military intelligence learned a dangerous lesson. It wasn't that such operations shouldn't exist. It was that they should never be traceable again. Thus began an era of plausible deniability, the art of waging secret wars that officially never happened. Coups, assassinations, and psychological operations became the new battlegrounds. Guatemala, Congo, Laos, Chile, Iran. Everywhere the same invisible hand. Shaping governments, influencing populations, rewriting events before they even happened. Meanwhile, the story of Operation Northwoods remained buried. Most Americans had never even heard the name. It wasn't mentioned in classrooms. It wasn't printed in newspapers. It wasn't taught in military academies. It was as if it had never existed, except to those who'd seen the document or heard whispers of what almost was. And those who knew understood something chilling. If history had tilted just slightly, if Kennedy had said yes instead of no, the 20th century would have unfolded differently. Because imagine, for a moment, a passenger jet exploding in the Caribbean skies. Television screens across America filled with weeping families. Cuba condemned by every world leader. American troops landing on Cuban beaches under a banner of justice. And all of it, a lie. The thought lingers like smoke. In a way, Northwoods represented a mirror showing not what America was, but what it could become if fear outweighed morality. The very people sworn to defend democracy had proposed deceiving it, to manufacture tragedy, to sacrifice innocence for strategy. That was the line Kennedy refused to cross. And yet, he would not live to see the full consequences of that decision. November 22, 1963, Dallas, Texas. The motorcade turned down Elm Street. Crowds cheered, waving flags under the midday sun. Then 3 shots. And in an instant, the young president who had refused Operation Northwoods lay dying in the back seat of his limousine. The world stopped. Official investigations began. And the rumors followed. Because when power moves in shadows, truth is never simple. Many who had once been part of Kennedy's military and intelligence briefings found themselves questioned, quietly, about motives and loyalties. Could it be coincidence that a president who'd defied the war establishment was silenced within a year? There was no proof, only whispers. But the whispers never stopped. By the late 1960s, new leaders had taken control. The Vietnam War was raging. The military-industrial machine was in full motion. And Operation Northwoods, though forgotten, had planted its seed deep within the machinery of government. A seed that grew into something larger, the belief that perception was power, that wars could be fought not only on the battlefield, but in the mind of the public. Thus emerged a new era of psychological operations psyops, blending propaganda, staged events, and media manipulation. Television became a weapon, images a battlefield. The ghosts of Northwoods had evolved. In 1975, the Church Committee, a Senate investigation into intelligence abuses, uncovered shocking truths about decades of covert operations. Assassinations, coups, surveillance on American citizens. And though Northwoods wasn't the centerpiece of their report, its philosophy haunted every revelation. Because every operation, every secret action justified in the name of national security, echoed that same question. How far would America go to protect its image? And how much truth was the public allowed to know? Even after its declassification in the 1990s, most Americans dismissed Operation Northwoods as a historical curiosity, a relic of a paranoid era. But intelligence veterans knew better. They understood that what Northwoods revealed wasn't just a plan. It was a mindset, a formula. Fear, outrage, justification, power. And once such a formula exists, it never truly dies. Somewhere, deep in a classified archive, sits a folder marked with a fading label, Cuba, Contingency Operations, 1962. Inside, the original Northwoods memorandum lies preserved in perfect clarity. Signatures, notes, amendments. At the bottom of one page, scribbled in pencil, are three words that historians often overlook. They read simply, necessary if provoked. But who decides what provoked means? Who decides what's real and what's merely useful? What defines a nation, its ideals, or the illusions it's willing to create? The world had changed. The Cold War had thawed. The Berlin Wall had fallen. And yet, the fingerprints of Operation Northwoods still marked the unseen pages of modern history. Decades had passed since 1962, but the idea behind that plan, the manipulation of perception to justify power, had quietly evolved into an entire branch of modern warfare. Not the kind fought with tanks or missiles, but the kind fought with information. In the 21st century, wars no longer needed to be declared. They simply began with a rumor, a headline, or a viral image. The battlefield was no longer a foreign land. It was the human mind. And somewhere within that transformation, the philosophy that Northwoods had embodied found a new home. What had once been a secret military proposal had now become a doctrine of influence, practiced across governments, corporations, and digital networks. The story of Northwoods was finally revealed to the public in 1997 through declassified documents released by the U.S. National Security Archive. It made the news briefly before disappearing into the noise of the decade. Few paid attention. Fewer still understood what it truly meant. Because to most people, it sounded like an absurd conspiracy theory, the kind of dark government plot that belonged in fiction, not reality. But the document was real. The signatures were real. And the mindset behind it was timeless. To those studying national security history, Operation Northwoods became more than just a footnote. It became a warning, a glimpse into how fragile truth can be when power is unchecked. To others, within the intelligence community, it remained a lesson, not in what to do, but in how to do it without leaving a trail. In the years after September 11th, when fear once again gripped America, echoes of that mindset could be heard in the justifications for new wars. Televised briefings, intelligence reports, and dramatic narratives began shaping public opinion, leading to massive military actions thousands of miles away. History didn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymed. Northwoods had been about Cuba. The new wars were about the Middle East. But the underlying question was the same. What will the public believe? In 1962, that question was answered through controlled media and staged events. In the digital age, it was answered through algorithms and data. Propaganda no longer needed an official seal, it only needed virality. The same psychological principles once drafted by the Joint Chiefs had now become the DNA of online influence. The blending of truth and fiction, the careful crafting of outrage, the weaponization of emotion. Every trending post, every viral video, every orchestrated panic. All of it echoed the same strategy born in a Pentagon conference room more than 60 years ago. It is said that empires don't fall because of enemies abroad, but because of lies believed at home. Operation Northwoods was almost that lie. And though it was never executed, it proved something terrifying. That even in a democracy, truth could be engineered. One intelligence historian described it best. Northwoods was not a plan. It was a revelation that the machinery of government could turn against its own reflection. Imagine for a moment in today's world if a government sought to justify a war, a policy, or a crackdown. It wouldn't need to sink ships or blow up planes anymore. It would only need to shape the narrative. Because now, the battlefield isn't Guantanamo Bay or Havana. It's your screen, your feed, your mind. And that's where the true legacy of Operation Northwoods lives on, in the endless war for belief. Governments learned that truth was not an obstacle, but a resource to be managed. That control over perception was the ultimate weapon. And that the public's outrage, if guided properly, could become a tool as powerful as any army. But within that realization lies a paradox, because those same tools can also expose the truth. The same internet that spreads lies can also uncover secrets. The same digital trails that manufacture consent can also reveal manipulation. The line between light and shadow has never been thinner. Back in the archives, the Operation Northwoods document sits silently, sealed behind glass. A relic from another age. The pages are crisp, the ink slightly faded, but the words remain legible, sharp, haunting. Each proposal reads like a moral test humanity barely passed. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. We could blow up a drone aircraft and conduct funerals for mock victims. We could foster attempts on the lives of Cuban refugees. Every sentence drips with calculation and something colder, certainty. The certainty that public emotion could be controlled, that outrage could be engineered, that truth itself could be manufactured. And though the operation was never carried out, the belief that birthed it, that control requires illusion, has never truly died. In 2001, when the full document was first posted online, a new generation discovered it for the first time. Forums buzzed. Researchers dissected every line. Some dismissed it as ancient madness. Others saw it as proof that history is not written by heroes or villains, but by opportunists. And then, like most truths too uncomfortable to digest, it faded back into silence. Yet for those who study the patterns of power, the parallels never stop appearing. Each time a war begins with certainty but ends with questions. Each time surveillance expands under the banner of protection. Each time fear is used to justify control. The ghost of Operation Northwoods flickers, whispering, "Remember me." Today, few people in America even know the name. It's not mentioned in schools, not printed in textbooks, not spoken of in political speeches. But somewhere, in the training rooms of intelligence officers, its principles are still dissected, not as moral warnings, but as case studies. How to craft believable cover stories. How to create plausible deniability. How to guide public perception without leaving fingerprints. Northwoods has become what it was always meant to be: invisible. The most dangerous weapon is not the bomb or the bullet. It is the story that justifies them. Operation Northwoods was never carried out, but its spirit, its logic, its ghost, they survived. In the boardrooms where wars are planned, in the networks where truth is edited, and in the minds of those who still believe that fear is freedom. This is not just history. This is a warning, because every time a nation builds its strength on lies, the truth becomes its greatest enemy. Declassified by the U.S. Department of Defense, 1997. Operation Northwoods, the plan that could have changed America.